I'm Alexis S., and for my inquiry project, I picked a small business case study. I decided that I wanted to describe through my own personal journey. But first off, what is Microcampus? Microcampus is a program where 14 students are selected from Shanghai American School to go to a village in Yunnan for 28 days to experience the lifestyle. One of the projects included the inquiry project. This was basically an analysis that students would do in the village about a topic of choice. The small business case study interested me the most. Before jumping right in, let's take a step back all the way to Shanghai. Let's start with my initial research. One of the more memorable research pages that I found was one on small businesses. As I was reading, some things stood out to me. One was the compare and contrast that took place between small businesses and big corporations. From there, I was under the impression that all small businesses were affected by big corporations in some way or another, whether positively or negatively. Also, what I noticed was when I looked at the word business and defined it, it stated the practice of making one's living by engaging in commerce. To me, this simply meant a business was a company that created to grow, expand, and make money. From this influence, I started my 10 big questions. Among them, some turned out like this. But those were merely my previous impressions. After arriving in Xizhou, I met Mrs. Dong. She's a 67-year-old woman who has a stall right outside of Sifangjie, and she has been working there for 30 years. She ended up being my project partner. At her stall, she sold rice pudding and tofu. When I first started interviewing her, it was all about the numbers. All our interviews were about her costs, her revenues, her profits, her prices. But after I tallied it all up, it didn't fit. Her profits were not enough to sustain her living. It was her son and her pension, she told me later. I technically could have stopped there. I had enough information about what sustained her living and what she did to make her food and other things similar to that. Something didn't make sense to me. Her pension provided 800 RMB a month, and her son supported the food part of her lifestyle. So what did her tofu business bring her? Why did she continue to sell tofu if she did not need it to support her living? I slowly started to peel apart this story. Remember back when I was talking about my 10 big questions and how some of them were irrelevant to me right now? I found the answer to my question within the reason why she couldn't answer those questions. One of these questions were, what advice would you give a future entrepreneur? This became one of the questions that was removed. I had been influenced by both my parents from their jobs that all businesses had so many underlying factors to them, and that they influenced the way that their businesses worked. And I thought that all businesses worked this way and would have the same problems and issues as they did. That's when I had a little talk with Evie after teacher support later in the research process. She said that those things were irrelevant here. Many of the elderly shopkeepers here weren't here to build a big expanding business. They were merely here to sustain. They had the means of retiring and not working, but they decided not to so they could have something to wake up for in the morning. I still didn't understand. So I decided to take a look at Miss Dong's past. Miss Dong had grown up in Zhoucheng to a family of farmers. She spent her childhood learning all about farming and expected to become one when she grew up, like many of the other shopkeepers in Xizhou. She was taught how to make tofu from her grandmother at a young age, but back then it was merely a hobby. Miss Dong had a hard childhood, but it didn't really hurt her until the Great Leap Forward, and she injured her leg. After this, she was unable to farm due to the severity of her injuries. Even now, when I see her at her cart, she needs to limp to get to places. 25 years ago, Miss Dong decided to move down to Xizhou to sell tofu and has been doing so ever since. Still, I didn't understand. That's when I met her granddaughter. She was 6 years old, and when I saw her running up to Mrs. Dong and Mrs. Dong look of pure joy, it just seemed to click into place. This business, this square, this village was completely separate from the big bustling world I was used to. This community wasn't plagued with the corruption and the greed of people today, and this site was beautiful. And Mrs. Dong had her place in this little society, and her being there every day to serve people a nice dessert was her place there. Her simple existence there meant something to Mr. Ma, the antique dealer behind her, and her existence mattered to the chicken noodle stand across the street. Her existence mattered to the students coming home from school every day who wanted a snack, and people around her mattered to her too. This is when I realized I had changed too. I wasn't the girl I was back in Shanghai anymore. In Shanghai, I was a girl who was obsessed with everything inside the bubble, a world where the everyday gossip and useless, untrue rumors mattered. Out here, I was living in a preserved history. All around us were people who had lived through horrible and wonderful times that I had only heard about in books. Dull pages of black ink and white paper of people who were merely stories became alive in the memories of people who had endured life-threatening events silently and had finally decided that they could reveal their story. During the hike, I felt like I was suddenly yanked away from my comfort zone and thrown into this crazy situation. The hike was 3 days of arduous uphill climb. Still, when I got to the top, I felt like I could just reach up and touch the stars. Being up there gave me a sense of accomplishment and freedom, unlike anything I had felt before. I realized that in every situation, there would always have to be a process that we needed to pummel through to get to the final product. I also realized that the only reason why that time on the top of the mountain felt so amazing was because of that arduous climb up. So now I have come to my conclusion. This journey has taught me so much on so many different levels, and I would never give it up for anything. This final product of my inquiry work may not have the most information, but it means a lot to me because it shows how I have grown and changed over the weeks. Finally, there are some important people that I need to thank. I would like to thank Mrs. Dong for being there every day to patiently answer my questions and trying so hard to communicate with me. Thank you, Mrs. Yang, for being there to answer my questions and welcome me to Suzhou. Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Linton, for providing a home for us for 28 days. And finally, thank you, Mr. T and Miss Mai, for guiding me through the process and giving me this amazing experience. Colin Powell once said, "A dream doesn't become reality through magic. It takes sweat, determination, and hard work." And through this process, I have learned that.